Tonight we journey back to one of the most unforgettable winters in American history, the Great Blizzard of 1888. Imagine the mighty city of New York, full of bustling streets, clattering horse-drawn carriages and hurried footsteps along Broadway, suddenly brought to its knees by snow, wind and silence. For 2 days the city froze, as if time itself had stopped. Beneath a blanket of white, people were stranded. Families huddled in dark rooms and whole neighborhoods were buried in drifts taller than a man. Yet within that storm, there were also stories of courage, kindness, and quiet perseverance. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. If you're joining from the United States, perhaps late in the evening, or from Europe, where morning light might be breaking, or from anywhere else in the world, no matter the time, this story will wait for you, unfolding slowly, gently, like snowflakes drifting through the air. Don't forget to like this story, subscribe if you enjoy these historical journeys, and share a comment. Maybe tell us where you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. Now prepare yourself, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind wander back more than a century as we stepped quietly into the frozen streets of New York when the storm of storms descended upon the city. The early days of March 1888 in New York City carried no hint of the disaster to come. The streets were alive with the usual rhythm, children chasing one another on cobblestones, vendors calling out their goods, and women in long wool coats hurrying past with market baskets swinging from their arms. A cold wind swept down from the north, but it was nothing unusual, nothing that the city had not endured countless times before. In the harbor, ferries crisscrossed the waters between Brooklyn and Manhattan, their whistles echoing against the piers. Elevated trains rattled overhead, iron wheels screeching as sparks lit the morning gloom. Horse-drawn trolleys rolled steadily along their tracks, carrying clerks, dock workers, and schoolchildren through the bustling neighborhoods. Life in the city was brisk, hurried, and full of sound, and yet if one looked closely, there were small signs, clouds gathering in unfamiliar shapes. The way the air tasted, sharper, more brittle, carrying with it a stillness that seemed unnatural. Farmers outside the city noticed birds flying lower than usual, searching desperately for food. Seamen along the docks tightened the ropes on their vessels, sensing that the weather was about to change. But for most New Yorkers, these were only whispers in the background. That evening, lamps glowed warmly in tenement windows. The gaslights of Broadway flickered in the wind. Newspapers spoke casually of a coming snow, perhaps an inch or two. Nothing more. Families tucked themselves in, never imagining that by morning their city would be unrecognizable. The calm was deceptive, for beneath it the storm was gathering its strength. When dawn broke on March 11, 1888, the city awoke to a sky the color of pewter. Heavy clouds hung low over the skyline as if pressing down upon the rooftops. The first snowflakes came quietly drifting and swirling through the air, like delicate lace. They clung to iron railings, to the shoulders of passing men, to the brims of ladies' hats. At first people smiled. The snow was no stranger to New York, and a light fall in March was almost charming. Children tilted their faces upward, catching flakes on their tongues. But the flakes did not stop. They thickened, becoming more numerous, more insistent, fluttering sideways in the rising wind. By mid-morning the streets had grown slippery. Carriage wheels spun, horses strained against their loads, and street sweepers tried in vain to keep the thoroughfares clear. The snow stung, now sharp against the skin, and the air had turned bitterly cold. In the ferry slips, men muttered as the waters grew choppy, the East River swelling with restless waves. Commuters crossing from Brooklyn clutched their coats. Tighter eyes narrowed against the flakes that seemed to bite rather than melt. Elevated train platforms began to glaze with frost, and even the iron girders groaned in the sudden cold. Still, many dismissed it. A late snowstorm, people said, pulling scarves higher over their faces. It will pass by nightfall. Shops remained open, schools carried on, and the gas lamps flickered bravely in the midday dimness. Yet as the day wore on, the snow only deepened. Flakes no longer drifted, they slashed sideways, carried by winds that whistled through alleyways like ghostly voices. The city that had awakened to gray skies was now vanishing beneath a curtain of white, and still the storm was only beginning. By late afternoon, the snow had become relentless. What had begun as a gentle flurry now roared against the city with a fury that unsettled even the most seasoned New Yorkers. The wind screamed down Broadway, tearing at hats and coats, swirling snow into blinding sheets. Windows rattled in their frames and shutters banged violently against brick walls. The sound was a constant howl, a voice of nature reminding the city of its fragility. On the streets, carriages faltered. Horses, their breath rising in white plumes, balked and stumbled as drifts piled against their legs. Drivers shouted their calls, lost in the storm as wheels locked and carts overturned. Those who had set out for errands or work found themselves disoriented. Familiar streets vanished beneath swirling whiteness. Landmarks erased as if the city were being erased and redrawn with snow. The ferries were the first to surrender. By early evening, the waters of the East River had become so violent that captains dared not cross the slips. Once alive, with whistles and shouts, stood eerily quiet. Commuters were stranded, staring helplessly across the water as the city, on the opposite shore, disappeared into the blizzard shroud inside homes and boarding houses. Lamps glowed faintly against frosted panes. Families gathered closer to their stoves listening to the storm. The walls' conversations grew hushed. The newspaper's casual forecast seemed now like a cruel mistake. This was no ordinary snowfall. As night descended, the storm's true strength unfurled. Snow fell so thickly that it seemed the air itself had turned solid, pressing upon every rooftop, every alley, every trembling window pane. The city was no longer simply enduring a storm. It was under siege. Night came early that Sunday, though it was hard to tell when daylight ended, for the skies had already been dark and oppressive since morning. As the storm deepened, the city of New York slipped into a strange twilight, lit only by the dim flicker of gas lamps struggling against the swirling white. Their glow reached only a few feet before vanishing into the storm, casting eerie halos in the night. The streets, once busy and alive, had grown silent, except for the howling of the wind. Drifts rose higher than doorsteps, pressing against shop fronts and burying signs. Doors that opened inwards became a blessing, while those that opened outwards were blocked by walls of snow. Horses, abandoned by their drivers, stood trembling icicles clinging to their men. The few pedestrians still caught outside bent double against the gale, scarves stiff with frost, eyelashes crusted with ice. Inside, families huddled together, the walls groaning as if the buildings themselves strained under the weight of the storm. Coal stoves burned fiercely, but the cold crept in through every crack, a steady, unyielding presence. Children were tucked beneath extra quilts, while parents whispered anxiously about dwindling supplies and the dangers of leaving home. Some, however, had no shelter at all. The poor, the homeless, and those stranded between destinations found themselves seeking refuge in doorways, beneath stairwells, or in the corners of train stations, anywhere to escape the cutting wind. For them, the night stretched long and merciless, the snow burying their shapes in quiet layers. Above it all, the storm raged with no sign of mercy. Snow fell, not in flakes, but in trance, a white wall that consumed the city. The blizzard of 1888 had arrived in full, and New York was sinking beneath its weight. By the time midnight struck, New York City had grown unrecognizable. Streets that only hours earlier bustled with wagons, carriages, and hurried footsteps now lay buried under mountains of snow. Broadway, the Grand Thor, looked less like a city street and more like a frozen canyon, its buildings half concealed by drifting walls of white. The air was thick, with snow so heavy that sound itself seemed smothered. Even the constant rumble of the elevated trains had gone silent, their tracks choked and abandoned. Only the wind remained alive. It shrieked around corners, rattled loose shutters, and whistled through the gaps of closed windows. It sculpted drifts into strange shapes, arches, ridges, and curling spires that leaned like frozen waves ready to crash. Lamp posts stood half-buried, their light barely visible above the storm, casting ghostly shadows that wavered in the blowing snow. Here and there, a lone figure still struggled onward, wrapped in wool and desperation. Boots sank deep with each step, and progress was measured in inches rather than blocks. Some carried lanterns that swayed dimly in the gale, their flames sputtering as if ready to surrender. Others abandoned the fight altogether, stumbling into churches or taverns whose doors remained open as havens against the cold. But for most of the city there was no more movement. Windows were darkened, doors bolted, fires tended as best as they could be. The city that never seemed to sleep had been forced into stillness, wrapped in the suffocating silence of snow. It was a silence filled with unease because beneath it all, every heart knew that the storm had only just begun. In the early hours of March 12th, the elevated railways that had once been the proud veins of the city stood frozen, their iron tracks buried under ice and snow. Trains that had set out optimistically in the morning were now stranded, their carriages abandoned or else filled with shivering passengers who had no choice but to wait. The wheels were locked in place, iron grinding uselessly against the rails, and even the strongest engines could not push through the towering drifts. Some passengers tried to force open the doors, only to be met with walls of snow that pressed like barricades against the cars. A few managed to climb down, stumbling into the storm, but the streets below were no safer. The platforms high above the city had turned into prisons of iron and ice, where the wind struck without mercy. Down in the stations, people crowded into waiting rooms, the stoves glowing red but barely keeping the cold at bay. Mothers wrapped shawls around their children. Men stamped out their boots to bring life back into frozen toes, and newspaper vendors passed out extra editions, sheets of newsprint that quickly doubled as makeshift blankets. At the great depot, like Grand Central, confusion reigned. Telegraph lines had already begun to fail, and trains that should have carried passengers out of the city never arrived. Men paced the platforms, peering into the blizzard, as if expecting the dark shape of a locomotive to suddenly emerge, but nothing came. The iron machines that once symbolized progress and speed had been silenced. The blizzard had stopped them cold, leaving thousands stranded in a city that was shrinking by the hour into a snowbound island. As dawn struggled to rise on March 12th, the East River, normally restless, alive with ferries and cargo ships, lay choked with ice. The wind had driven sheets of frozen water together, cracking and grinding them until the current seemed to vanish beneath a jagged white skin. Ferries that had dared the crossing the night before were now trapped, their decks coated in snow, their smokestacks iced over. Some sat anchored mid-river, their crews huddled below deck, unable to move forward or return. The slips along Manhattan's edge were deserted, silent, except for the creak of frozen ropes pulling against wooden posts, normally alive with whistles, shouts, and the steady splash of oars. The waterfront felt like a graveyard of stillness. Longshoremen wrapped in heavy coats stood with their hands shoved deep in their pockets, staring out at the icebound water with disbelief. For Brooklyn commuters, the river was a barrier that could not be crossed. Thousands who relied on ferries to reach Manhattan were cut off entirely. Some tried to walk across the ice-choked stretches, only to find the surface treacherous, breaking beneath their weight. Rescue crews patrolled the shores, pulling desperate men back to safety, their voices swallowed quickly by the storm. Ships anchored in the harbor fared little better. Snow piled high on decks. Sails hung stiff as boards and rigging groaned under layers of ice. Captains lit lanterns that swung dimly in the gale, signaling their presence to any who might still be moving through the channel, but few dared. New York had always been a city bound by its waters, but now those waters had turned into walls of ice. The island of Manhattan was trapped, encased by snow above and frozen river below. Its lifeline severed by mid-morning on March 12th. Another lifeline of the city failed, the telegraph lines. For decades, the sharp clicks of Morse code had connected New York to the wider world, sending news, orders, and reassurances across vast distances in moments. But now, under the weight of ice and the fury of the gale, the wires snapped one by one, their heavy cords sagging and then breaking with a sound like a gunshot. Poles leaned dangerously in the streets, their tops swaying like brittle branches. Some crashed down entirely, vanishing into snowbanks with a muffled thud. Others whipped violently in the wind, sparking where wires struck against one another. What messages had been traveling along those wires? Business deals, family notes, urgent warnings vanished into silence. In the telegraph offices, operators sat at their tables waiting, their fingers poised over the keys, but the machines clicked no more. The lines to Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington were gone. Western Union clerks shuffled restlessly, rubbing their hands before stoves, shaking their heads at the growing reports of failure. For the first time in years, New York found itself cut off not just from its neighbors but from the world. The newspapers, always hungry for the latest updates, fell silent too. Without wires, there was no fresh news to print. Editors sat with empty pages while printers waited for words that never came. Citizens, accustomed to the constant hum of information, were left instead with rumor, whispered speculations traded in taverns and boarding houses, each one more dire than the last. The city was beginning to feel like an island, not only surrounded by frozen rivers and buried in snow, but isolated in every way, its voice to the outside world severed. The blizzard was no longer just a storm. It was a wall of silence, a curtain between New York and the rest of humanity. By late morning, the streets of New York had become a labyrinth of snowdrifts and abandoned carriages. Wagons sat half-buried, their wheels frozen in place, their horses long since led away to whatever stables could be found. Some animals had collapsed where they stood, their bodies stiff beneath the white cover, silent witnesses to the storm's cruelty. Pedestrians who had dared to venture out found themselves in a world transformed. Sidewalks vanished beneath banks that rose taller than a man. To move forward, one had to climb, stumble, and sink again. Every step of battle against the snow that clutched like quicksand street. Signs disappeared, landmarks blurred, and whole blocks seemed to dissolve into the blizzard's endless. White men tied scarves over their mouths, pulling them tight until their breath froze in the fabric. Women clutched their skirts and lifted them high, though it did little to keep the snow from seeping into boots and stockings. Children cried as the wind whipped them sideways, their small hands clinging desperately to parents who themselves struggled to stand. Those who sought warmth ducked into taverns, shops, or churches where strangers pressed close together, shaking snow from their coats, their faces raw with cold. The interiors of these places glowed dimly, candles and stoves fighting against the creeping chill that slipped in through every door. Conversations hushed as people shared stories of who had made it home, who had not, and who still wandered the streets in the white chaos. For many, the journey was simply too much. They stopped, huddled in doorways or beneath stoops, eyes closing as exhaustion tugged them toward sleep. But in such cold, sleep was a danger greater than the storm itself. The snow did not forgive those who rested, and so the streets filled with figures moving slowly, endlessly searching for shelter that might or might not be found. The city that had once thrived on movement and speed was now crawling every step a struggle against nature's unyielding hand. Inside the homes and boarding houses of New York, life clung stubbornly to warmth and light. Coal stoves hissed and roared, casting a reddish glow that fought back the shadows creeping from the corners of rooms. Families clustered close, sharing body heat and whispering, soft words to calm children whose eyes were wide with wonder and fear. The smell of burning coal, mixed with the faint scent of damp wool and wet boots, creating an atmosphere both comforting and heavy with the weight of the storm. Outside, gas lamps flickered as the wind pressed against glass panes, their flames bending and swaying in the draft. In wealthier homes, the warmth was steadier, fires fed with neatly chopped wood rooms insulated from the snow pressing against walls. In tenements and smaller apartments, the battle against cold was harder. Windows rattled, thin walls shivered, and even the thickest blanket sometimes failed to hold the chill at bay. Through the night and into the morning, families performed quiet rituals to survive. Mothers brewed teas and soups, stirring pots slowly over small flames while fathers cleared snow from doorways, attempting to keep some semblance of access to the streets. Children, bundled and shivering, played softly with wooden toys or listened as elders told stories to distract from the biting cold. Every crackle of fire, every tiny glow of light became a small victory against the blizzard's relentless power. And yet even here the storm could not be ignored. Each gust rattling the windows was a reminder that the world outside was locked in fury. Each drift that piled higher against the doors whispered of isolation, of a city cut off from its usual rhythm. The night stretched on, long and oppressive, but in the glowing warmth of lamps and stoves, New Yorkers held on to hope, a fragile, flickering hope, much like the flames that kept their homes from freezing entirely. While many sought refuge in warm homes, hundreds of New Yorkers had no place to shelter from the storm. The city's poor and homeless were forced to confront the blizzard in its full, merciless force. Snow piled over benches, doorways, and alleyways, erasing familiar places where one might usually find a moment's rest. Every gust of wind cut through thin coats and tattered shows, chilling bodies to the bone. Some sought temporary shelter under the eaves of buildings or in the recessed steps of brownstones, huddling together for shared warmth. Others tried to make small fires using scraps of wood or newspapers, only to have the flames die quickly in the damp, frozen air. Their faces were etched with exhaustion and determination, eyes scanning constantly for a break in the storm, or a building that might offer sanctuary. City workers and volunteers did what they could, trudging through deep snow to deliver blankets, food, and words of comfort. Churches and mission houses opened their doors, taking in those who could reach them, but many were simply too far from safety, trapped in streets that had become unrecognizable. The snow swallowed footsteps, masking the approach of help until it was almost too late. The cold was not just an inconvenience. It was a silent predator, fingers and toes numbed quickly. Breath froze in the air, and exhaustion threatened to pull even the strongest into sleep from which they might never awaken. Still, in the faces of the homeless, there remained stubborn resilience, small acts of care, the sharing of scraps, whispered encouragements that each could survive. Another hour, another drift, another gust of wind. In this way, the blizzard revealed both cruelty and courage, its bitter white fury pressing down on the helpless and yet human spirit refusing to yield entirely to its might. By mid-afternoon on March 12th, entire streets had begun to vanish beneath the growing snowdrifts. Doorways that had once welcomed families and shopkeepers were now half buried, some nearly swallowed entirely by towering walls of white. Those attempting to enter or leave their homes found themselves shoveling continuously, only to see the wind erase their work almost immediately. Windows were encrusted with ice patterns of frost forming delicate lace that blurred the view of the storm outside. Inside, candlelight danced against these icy curtains, creating a surreal, dreamlike glow that softened the harsh reality of the cold. Each doorway became a threshold between warmth and the blizzard's relentless bite, a fragile barrier against a world that had gone mad. With snow, shopkeepers tried desperately to keep their doors open. Bread, coal and milk were in high demand, and some braved the storm to deliver necessities, moving carefully through streets where drifts reached knee-height and beyond, yet every delivery was a battle. Snow whipped at their faces in gusts, threatened to topple carts or sweep packages away, even for those safely inside. The sight of drifted doorways brought unease. It was a visible reminder that the storm was not merely an inconvenience, it was an overwhelming force capable of reshaping the familiar world in a single night. Families listened to the wind press against their doors, feeling the house tremble, and wondered whether the city outside could endure much longer. Still, behind every drifted doorway there was life. Warmth persisted in stoves and hearths. Voices murmured softly, offering reassurance. The human presence, small but determined, remained a steadfast counterpoint to the storm's indifferent power. As the blizzard stretched into its second day, the city began to feel the strain of dwindling supplies. Coal, the lifeblood of warmth, was being consumed faster than deliveries could arrive. In the wealthier districts, fires burned bright but required constant tending, the smell of smoke and soot filling rooms already heavy with worry. In tenements and poorer neighborhoods, families faced the real threat of running out, entirely forced to ration what little remained. Food, too, became precious. Markets that had remained open on the first morning were now shuttered, their entrances blocked by snow. Housewives and cooks dug through cupboards, planning meals from scraps and leftovers, turning humble ingredients into nourishing soups and stews. For many, each meal was both sustenance and a small victory, a way to push back against the cold that seemed intent on seeping into every corner of a life. Street vendors, who had once called their wares to the bustling crowds, now trudged through drifts with carts tipped dangerously under the weight of snow. Their voices carried only faintly above the wind, and few had the strength or inclination to stop. The city's usual commerce had slowed to a crawl. Survival, replacing trade, is the day's primary concern. Even water became a challenge. Pipes froze, wells grew icy, and fetching liquid required careful effort and endurance. Mothers balanced pails, carefully negotiating drifts while children watched shivering, hoping for the warmth of a hot drink once they returned inside. Every task, once simple, had become monumental, and each small success felt like an extraordinary achievement. Against the storm, despite these challenges, the people of New York endured. There was fear, certainly, and fatigue, but also determination. Every fire lit, every meal prepared, every pail of water carried represented a quiet rebellion against the blizzard's dominance, a testament to the stubborn resilience of human life. Through the howling wind, muffled voices began to carry across the snow-covered streets. At first, it was difficult to discern whether they were real or imagined whispers of hope or desperation. Some came from neighbors calling to one another, checking to see if anyone had survived the night, if fire still burned, if warmth remained. Others were cries of stranded pedestrians, lost amid the drifts and seeking shelter. The blizzard played tricks on the ears. A shout might be swallowed instantly, returning only as an eerie echo that seemed to come from every direction. Snow flattened sound, creating a quiet so dense that even footsteps felt distant. Yet within this strange silence, human voices were small beacons, markers of life against the storm's overwhelming power. Families pressed faces to frosted windows, listening. Children pointed and shivered, imagining the figures as wandering spirits, while parents murmured reassurances guiding them away from the temptation to venture out. In some neighborhoods, neighbors took to the streets together, forming small groups to help dig out doorways, check on the ill, and carry necessities to those unable to move. Even the bravest were humbled. The wind cut sharply, snatching words away mid-sentence, and drifts swallowed feet before progress could be made. Still, there was courage in every attempt, every voice that pierced the snow, Every call across the alley was a reminder that New York was not yet defeated. Humanity persisted, even in the white chaos, clinging to one another in whispers, shouts and gestures defying the blizzard, one small act at a time. As March 12th gave way to night, once more the blizzard showed no sign of weakening. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger, as if determined to grind the city into complete submission. The snow no longer fell in flakes, but in swirling sheets racing sideways through the streets, driven by winds that roared like the sea. It piled at top rooftops, slid down stairwells and swept through alleys with a force that felt almost alive. For many, this second night was the hardest yet. The first day had been filled with shock and frantic effort, digging, gathering, enduring, but now exhaustion set in arms, acid from shoveling. Bodies trembled from hours spent fighting the cold. Even hope felt heavy, sagging beneath the endless weight of white inside. Families clung closer than before. Fires were stoked higher, blankets layered deeper, and conversations grew quieter. Some prayed aloud, their voices trembling. Others stared silently into the flames, wondering when the storm would end or if it would end at all. Children, too tired to play, drifted to sleep against their mothers' laps, their dreams filled with visions of snowdrifts and roaring wind. In hospitals, doctors and nurses worked by the dim glow of lanterns, treating frostbite and exhaustion, doing what they could with limited supplies. Police and firefighters, those who could still move, patrolled the streets, checking doorways for signs of life. Some rescues came too late, their discoveries solemn reminders of the storm's merciless nature. And still the snow came. Hour after hour it buried the city deeper, erasing fences, swallowing lampposts and pressing against windows with a weight that groaned like distant thunder. The night felt endless, as if the world had forgotten how to wake. Yet even amid that despair, a strange calm settled over the city. New York was silent and still. Beneath its icy shell paused, waiting, enduring. And though no one could see beyond the storm, there was a quiet, unspoken truth in every flickering flame and beating heart. Morning would come, it had to. When morning finally broke, on March 13th, it brought little relief. The storm had not ended. It still howled with the same ferocity, but in the faint gray light the scale of its destruction became visible. New York was unrecognizable, a city reshaped by snow and silence. Streets were no longer streets, but vast trenches carved between walls of white drifts, climbed as high as second-story windows, burying doors and trapping families inside their homes. Entire rows of houses appeared to vanish their roofs, the only sign of what lay beneath. Shops and storefronts were sealed away behind walls of snow, as though the blizzard had locked the city in a frozen vault. Those who managed to open their doors stepped into a world that felt otherworldly. Silence pressed in on all sides, broken only by the whistle of the wind and the muffled creak of snow shifting beneath its own weight. People moved cautiously like explorers in a strange new land, each step sinking deep into the icy powder. Some carried shovels, others lanterns, but all wore the same expression, part disbelief, part determination. Horses and wagons remained buried where they had fallen. Telegraph poles lay snapped and twisted, jutting from the snow like broken ribs. The elevated train tracks loomed overhead, empty and useless, their cars abandoned like relics of another age. New York, a city of motion, of constant noise and bustle, now stood still, locked in ice and silence. Yet even amid the desolation, there were signs of resilience. Smoke rose from chimneys, a promise of life within footprints wound cautiously through narrow paths connecting neighbor to neighbor. People called out across drifts, their voices carried briefly by the wind. Before being swallowed in white, the blizzard had buried the city, yes, but it had not buried its people. As the city awoke to its snowbound reality, the work of survival began in earnest. Men and women armed themselves with shovels, picks, and even cooking pots, carving narrow tunnels through the drifts that blocked their doors. Every strike of metal against ice rang hollow in the muffled silence, a rhythm of defiance against the storm. Children bundled in layers of wool helped as best they could, scooping snow with tin pails in their small gloved hands. The work was exhausting. For every path cleared, the wind swept new snow across it, filling the space within minutes. Still, the effort continued, because movement meant connection. Neighbors dug toward one another, calling encouragement as they drew closer, cheering when hands finally clasped through the snow. Whole blocks became communities united in labor, each shovel stroke carrying the promise of shared warmth and shared survival. Inside, families rationed what they had. Bread was sliced thinner, broth stretched with every scrap of vegetable, and tea leaves were reused until they surrendered their last bit of flavor. Coal was burned sparingly. Stoves fed just enough to keep frost from claiming the walls. Every ember mattered. Every sip of warmth was cherished. Elsewhere, teams of volunteers attempted to dig out the main thoroughfares. Broadway, Fifth Avenue and Bowery all became sites of desperate labor, as men worked side by side to create passage for emergency wagons and those seeking medical aid. Yet progress was slow, for the drifts towered like walls, and the storm's breath still swept fiercely across the city and through it. All hope glimmered, though weary, though cold. The people of New York did not surrender. They worked step by step, shovel by shovel, to carve life back into a city the blizzard had tried to erase. For many who had set out on ordinary errands or journeys before the storm closed its grip, the city became a vast frozen prison. Train passengers still sat stranded in darkened cars, their breaths clouding the air, lanterns dimming as fuel ran low. Ferry travelers who had abandoned their vessels sought shelter in warehouses along the docks, sleeping on crates beneath the creak of ice, pressing against the halls. Hotels filled quickly, their lobbies crowded with weary strangers who had nowhere else to go. Mattresses were dragged into hallways. Blankets stretched across armchairs, and strangers became reluctant companions bound together by the same fate. For those with coin, the accommodations were tolerable. Stews and coffee served in the dining rooms. Stoves tended carefully through the night. For the less fortunate, benches, stairwells, and even entry foyers became makeshift beds. Some travelers wandered the streets in search of shelter, lanterns in hand, their faces raw and pale beneath layers of frost. Boarding houses took in as many as they could, but space was scarce, and every hearth already crowded with desperate souls. There were stories of shopkeepers unlocking their doors to let travelers huddle inside their shelves, serving as resting places until the storm would relent. Perhaps hardest of all were those separated from their families. Fathers who had left Brooklyn for work in Manhattan found themselves trapped on the wrong side of the frozen river, unable to return home. Children waited anxiously at windows for parents who never appeared through the white curtain of snow. Each passing hour brought deeper worry as the storm stretched ordinary delays into unbearable separations. New York was a city built on movement, yet now it was frozen still. Travelers, workers, families, all caught between destinations, waited in limbo, their only task to endure until the blizzard showed mercy. By the second day of the blizzard, the city streets no longer resembled streets at all. They had transformed into deep, winding corridors of snow, silent and strange. The usual clatter of hooves, the creak of wagon wheels, the ringing calls of vendors, all of it was gone. In its place lay a heavy, unnatural hush, broken only by the hiss of falling snow and the restless groan of wind around corners. Horses that had not been led inside before the storm now stood frozen in place, draped in a mantle of white, their bodies still and stiff beneath the drifts. Wagons sat abandoned, their wheels half buried, their loads long forgotten. Even the streetcars, so lively on any other day, had vanished beneath the snowbanks, their tracks erased from sight. To walk the streets was to step into another world. Lantern light glowed faintly from windows above, casting golden halos into the white darkness while below figures trudged slowly, heads bowed, bundled in scarves and shawls. They walked, in single file, following narrow tracks carved earlier that day, their footsteps swallowed quickly by the storm. Some carried baskets of bread wrapped carefully against the cold, while others bore bundles of wood or coal scavenged from neighbors. In this strange new silence, each sound took on weight. A shovel scraping stone, a door creaking open, a child's muffled cough behind a scarf. For those who paused and looked upward, the city seemed enchanted. Snow draped across the ironwork of balconies, softened the sharp edges of rooftops and turned gas lamps into glowing orbs haloed in mist. It was beautiful in a way, yet beneath the beauty lay the knowledge of hardship, of danger, of a city brought to its knees by nature's fury. New York's heartbeat was still there, but muffled, slowed, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for release. As the storm wore on, the true enemy was no longer the snow but the cold itself. It crept into every corner of the city, seeping through shutters, stealing into bedrooms and gnawing at the bones of all who endured. Inside homes, frost formed on window panes in intricate patterns, delicate as lace yet merciless in meaning. Breath lingered in the air, visible even indoors, and water in basins froze solid. Overnight, families huddled close to their stoves, feeding them scraps of coal, wood or anything that might burn, old boxes, broken furniture. Even newspapers rolled tightly into logs. The fires crackled faintly, not strong enough to chase the chill, but just enough to keep it from taking over completely. At night, beds became fortresses of blankets and quilts, children curled together for warmth, their parents wrapping arms around them like shields. Still, the cold found its way in, toes grew numb, fingers stiff, and every cough carried with it the fear of sickness taking root in the lungs. Outside, the cold turned labor into trial. Shoveling snow became an ordeal, each breath stinging the chest, each movement slowed by heavy clothing, stiff with ice. Faces grew raw, cheeks cracked and red, and beards carried icicles that blinkered faintly when men spoke. Those who walked too far, too long, risked their strength giving out before they reached shelter. Yet amid the struggle, the cold also drew people together. Neighbors invited one another inside, sharing fire and tea, even when space was scarce. Strangers paused to offer gloved hands when someone stumbled, lifting them from the drifts. It was as though the storm, in all its cruelty, reminded New Yorkers that survival was never meant to be faced alone. In the heart of the blizzard, the telegraph wires, the veins of communication had snapped and fallen. With them went the city's connection to the outside world. Messages could no longer flow between New York and Boston, Philadelphia or Washington. For the first time in years, the great metropolis stood isolated, its voices cut off, its cries for help swallowed by the storm. Beneath the weight of snow, telegraph poles leaned drunkenly, their wires coiled and tangled like snakes across the drifts. Some disappeared entirely, buried in heaps that stretched higher than a man. Where the wind allowed a glimpse, the line swung uselessly, humming faintly in the icy gusts. For businesses, this silence was disastrous. Merchants who relied on daily reports from distant markets had no idea whether their goods would ever arrive. Banks waited in unease, unable to send or receive word of transactions. Families, too, suffered most bitterly, for they could not send word to loved ones caught outside the city. A mother waiting for news of her son in Philadelphia, a husband hoping to hear from his wife stranded in Boston. All were left in knowing uncertainty. Messengers on foot tried to carry notes through the buried streets, their bags slung heavy on their shoulders. Some succeeded, trudging door to door, their boots sinking knee-deep in snow. But many failed. The storm swallowed paths, erased directions, and left couriers wandering, lost in the blinding white. There were whispers of boys who had vanished, their deliveries never made. their small figures claimed by the drifts before they could reach their destination. The silence was more than an inconvenience. It was a wound in a city so alive with words, with trade, with constant exchange. The sudden absence of communication pressed down like the snow itself, heavy and suffocating. And yet, within that silence, neighbors leaned closer. Voices carried over fences and across snow tunnels. In the absence of wires, it was human voices, warm, strained but alive, that kept the city connected. When night fell again, the city transformed into a strange, dreamlike landscape. Gas lamps, half buried in snow, burned faintly through their glass, casting only small pools of light in the vast white darkness. But it was not enough. Most streets remained shrouded in shadow, where the storm still hissed and whispered through the drifts. So the people of New York turned to their lanterns. Every home that still had oil lit one, setting it in a window, so its glow might pierce the storm. Flickering flames dotted the city like constellations, guiding lost travelers and giving comfort to those trapped within. Children pressed their noses to the glass, watching the lanterns sway in the wind as though they were beacons calling out, "We are here. We endure, we wait for dawn." In the streets, those brave enough to venture out carried their own lamps, the light bobbing as they trudged through the snow. From above, it must have seemed as though fireflies moved through frozen canyons, disappearing behind walls of white, then reappearing again in the gloom. Neighbors recognized each other, not by face but by the glow of a familiar lantern swaying gently as it approached. There was something almost sacred about the sight. Families gathered around their light as though it were an altar, whispering prayers for warmth, for food, for safety. Even strangers passing by a lit window felt a spark of reassurance. The city, though beaten, was still alive, and its people still clung to one another through the glow of shared light. And in that fragile radiance, New York seemed for a moment not like a city defeated, but like one holding its breath in quiet resilience, waiting for the storm to pass. By the storm's third day, the sheer weight of snow became a danger of its own. Roofs sagged under the crushing burden, their beams groaning in protest with each new drift that settled upon them. Icicles, heavy and jagged, hung like spears from gutters and cornices, ready to shatter at the faintest tremor. In poorer neighborhoods, where houses were smaller and roofs less sturdy, families climbed up with shovels, risking the icy wind, to scrape away what they could. Each step was perilous, the shingles slick, the footing uncertain, but they worked steadily, knowing that to do nothing was to risk collapse. Mothers called from windows, begging their husbands and sons to be careful, while below children gathered the snow that was pushed down, piling it into mounds that already touched their windowsills. Shops and warehouses suffered too. The weight pressed down on awnings until they ripped and tore, spilling their burden in sudden thunderous crashes that startled passers-by. In some streets, walls gave way, sending cascades of snow and broken timber into the thoroughfare. Every creak in the night set hearts racing, for no one knew whether it was merely the wind or the warning of a roof about to yield. Yet despite the danger, there was also an odd beauty. Flat rooftops became rolling white hills, smooth and unbroken, stretching across whole blocks like a vast northern landscape. Chimneys poke through like lonely trees on a frozen plain. There are thin threads of smoke rising into the pale sky. In the stillness between gusts, the snow seemed almost alive, shifting faintly, settling deeper, as if breathing with a storm itself. New Yorkers looked up with both awe and dread, knowing that the snow was more than a blanket. It was a burden, and one that could not be borne forever. Even as the blizzard reached its fiercest, the human spirit remained alive. In small, quiet acts of kindness, neighbors shared what little they had: extra coal, a loaf of bread, a cup of hot tea. In narrow alleyways, strangers offered hands to help each other climb over drifts that blocked doorways or paths. These moments were fleeting, yet they carried warmth stronger than any fire. In churches, the doors were kept open for those who had no other shelter. Candles flickered on wooden tables, illuminating faces pale from cold, eyes wide with fatigue. Volunteers served soups and stews, speaking softly to calm children who trembled in the chill. The sound of laughter or even a smile became a rare treasure, echoing against the muffled walls of snow. Beyond, on the streets, men formed small chains to carry supplies through deep drifts: a basket of bread, a bundle of firewood, a single coat. Each item was passed hand to hand, a tangible promise that no one would be left entirely alone, even in exhaustion, even in the face of danger. People noticed each other. A glance, a nod, a helping hand became a lifeline, reminding all that survival was as much about community as it was about courage. It was in these acts, quiet and uncelebrated, that New York's true resilience shone. The storm was brutal, indifferent, vast, but human hearts, steadfast and generous, refused to surrender. Amid the white chaos, there was still light, still warmth, still connection. Amid the chaos, the delivery of essential goods became a perilous task. Bakers, milkmen, and coal carriers struggled through drifts that reached above their knees. Carts often tipped or trapped entirely beneath the snow. Horses cloaked in frost pawed desperately at the ground, their breath rising in frozen clouds as drivers urged them forward. In some neighborhoods, small teams of men carried supplies by hand, sliding them over snowbanks or hoisting them through narrow tunnels carved between buildings. Loaves of bread wrapped in paper became treasures, passed carefully from one pair of hands to another, while buckets of hot soup were shielded against the biting wind until they reached a family's hearth. Every delivery felt like a minor miracle, a moment of triumph in a city otherwise trapped by ice. For those receiving the goods, gratitude was quiet but profound. A mother accepted a loaf of bread with trembling hands, whispering thanks as her children huddled closer. A sickly child was given warm milk, the steam rising into his frozen cheeks. Even in the midst of exhaustion, fear, and cold, these small acts of care connected the city, weaving threads of human warmth through the vast, unyielding white outside. The snow continued its relentless fall, erasing tracks almost as quickly as they were made. Every journey was a challenge, every delivery an act of endurance, yet through it all, New Yorkers pressed on each step, a quiet defiance against the storm, a testament to their determination not only to survive but to ensure others could as well. Children, often the most vulnerable in the storm, found themselves caught between fascination and fear. Indoors, they huddled beneath layers of blankets, listening to the wind whip against windows and the groan of roofs sagging under snow. Some whispered stories of winter wonders, imagining snow castles and frozen rivers, while others clung to parents, their small bodies shivering despite thick clothing. Outside, the bravest, or perhaps the most restless, attempted to explore the new, surreal landscape. Tiny footprints traced through deep drifts, only to vanish moments later under the next swirl of snow. Sleds and makeshift toboggans became precious playthings, though each descent was measured against the danger of hidden obstacles, icy patches, or sharp wooden fences. Parents watched anxiously, balancing the need for distraction with the ever-present risk of frostbite or getting lost in the whitened streets. Voices carried across drifts, calling children back from places they should not wander. Yet each return was a small relief, a reminder that even amid chaos, family held fast within homes. Children became quiet observers of the surrounding efforts. They saw coal shoveled, fires stoked, neighbors helping neighbors, and they learned the endurance and courage required to survive. Some older children helped as best they could, passing logs, sweeping snow from doorways, or carrying water from melted ice. Their work was small but meaningful, and in it they found a sense of purpose, a quiet contribution to the collective struggle. Even as the blizzard raged on, the city's youngest hearts adapted, learning resilience in the hardest of lessons. In their laughter, hushed whispers and tentative steps. Outside there remained a fragile light, a promise that life, no matter how white and cold, would continue. Amid the relentless snow, New York's postal service ground to a near halt. Mail carriers, accustomed to navigating busy streets and bustling neighborhoods, now found themselves winged through drifts that rose above their knees. Letters and parcels, once lifelines, connecting families and businesses, were delayed or lost entirely beneath the snow. In some areas, carriers abandoned carts entirely, carrying bundles of letters by hand, balancing them against their chests as they trudged cautiously through white corridors. The wind snatched at envelopes, scattering them like fragile leaves across streets and sidewalks. Some letters were soaked or frozen, stiff, their ink smeared, messages blurred, yet each one retained the power to comfort, to connect, or to reassure. Families waited anxiously for news from loved ones, pressing their faces to frosted windows, imagining the familiar footsteps that would never come. Children asked repeatedly when the mail would arrive, voices tinged with worry in some homes. Letters that finally did arrive were celebrated quietly, treasured beyond their contents for the reminder that someone somewhere was thinking of them. For the postal workers, the storm was an unyielding test of endurance. They rose before dawn, battled exhaustion and frostbite, and carried on despite the apparent impossibility of their task. Each delivered letter was a small triumph, a proof that even amid chaos, human connection could not be fully severed. The blizzard had stopped commerce, travel, and communication, but it could not stop the determination of those who refused to let the city's voice fall silent. By the third morning of the storm, windows throughout the city were encrusted with frost, turning panes into shimmering landscapes of delicate white patterns. Each home became a small, self-contained world. The outside, blizzard obscured behind intricate ice filigree. Inside, families peered through the frozen glass, watching the storm continue its relentless work. Snow drifted in waves across streets, erased footprints and buried carriages almost entirely. Children pressed their noses against the cold, misting the glass with each breath, marveling at the transformation of familiar streets into an alien frozen world. Parents, though worried, could not help but share in the awe. The city, for all its hardship, had become strangely beautiful. The frost served another purpose as well. It was a shield behind the icy barrier. The warmth of stoves, blankets, and candlelight remained protected from the storm's full force. Families huddled near windows, watching without exposure, finding comfort in observation when action was impossible. The delicate patterns of frost reminded them that even in harshness there was artistry, a fragile balance between beauty and danger. In some neighborhoods, children traced shapes with gloved fingers, leaving fleeting messages on the glass. "Stay safe," one might write, only to have the wind erase it within minutes. Yet the act itself carried meaning, a small assertion of life and hope against the relentless storm. Even in the midst of suffering, the frost reminded New Yorkers that the city could endure, and that its people could find wonder even in the coldest, harshest of circumstances. As the blizzard pressed into its fourth day, food shortages began to unsettle the city. Groceries, who had struggled to keep their doors open during the first days, were now nearly empty. Shelves that once overflowed with bread, milk, vegetables, and meat were bare, the remaining stock reserved for those who had been able to secure it early. Families rationed carefully. Loaves of bread were sliced, paper thin, every crumb treasured. Milk was diluted or stretched. Soups made from scraps became standard. Fare and even simple meals felt like victories. Parents whispered instructions to children. Eat slowly, save a bite for later, share with a neighbor who has none. The storm had transformed everyday abundance into precious scarcity. Delivery carts became rare sights, moving slowly through drifts, often arriving hours late or not at all. Some vendors carried what they could by hand, negotiating icy paths and snow walls. Horses pulled wagons as best they could, but exhaustion and freezing hooves slowed even the strongest animals. Each delivery was a lifeline met with gratitude and relief, yet the blizzard threatened to make every journey impossible. The shortages weighed heavily on the city's spirits. Conversations in homes were quiet. Measured anxiety lingered alongside the warmth of stoves and the light of lanterns. Every meal consumed was balanced against the unknown, against the fear that tomorrow might bring even less. Yet even in scarcity, New Yorkers showed resilience. They shared what they had, improvised meals, and persisted in the belief that the storm, no matter how fierce, would eventually recede. And with it the city's trials would gradually ease. For the city's laborers, the blizzard presented both physical and emotional trials. Street cleaners, policemen and firefighters, those who maintained order and safety, faced the storm head-on, their days stretching endlessly as they cleared snow, checked on the trapped, and tended to emergencies. Their uniforms, once practical, were now thick, with layers of wool scarves and heavy boots. Gloves became soaked and stiff coats weighed down by ice, and every step forward required effort against deep drifts that pulled at legs and threatened to unbalance even the strongest men. Shovels scraped frozen streets, pickaxes chipped away at ice, and lanterns guided the workers' eyes in a world nearly blinded by white. Inside the city, factories had ground to a halt, leaving many workers idle yet trapped. Those who remained outdoors were often exhausted before the day truly began, their bodies aching from repeated battles against wind and snow. Yet there was determination in every motion. Streets needed clearing not only for survival but for communication, for supply, and for life to resume. Once the storm ended, even brief moments of relief were rare but treasured. A warm drink handed from a passerby, a shared cigarette and a fleeting pause, or a brief smile from a neighbor offered a spark of humanity. Amid the relentless ordeal, every task, every gesture reinforced the fragile bond between endurance and hope. In this way, the workers became the silent backbone of the city, carrying both supplies and spirits through a frozen, muffled world, ensuring that New York remained at least a city of life, despite the blizzard's overwhelming weight. Amid the human struggle, the animals of the city faced their own silent battle against the blizzard. Horses essential to transportation and delivery were wrapped in blankets or left in stables, their breaths rising in thick clouds as they pawed frozen ground. Many had already succumbed to exhaustion or the cold, their bodies stiff with frost. Dogs wandered the streets, some loyal companions beside their owners, others lost and frightened, their paws raw from trudging through knee-deep snow. Cats disappeared from usual alleyways, curling into hidden nooks for warmth, their meows muffled beneath drifts. Birds, too, were scarce, huddled in any shelter. They could find their chirps faint against the roar of the wind. For those who tended to animals, the care was constant. Water froze quickly, forcing repeated trips to supply drinking troughs. Food was rationed and handed carefully, often carried through drifts that slowed even the strongest humans. The bond between caretaker and creature was tested, yet each life saved was a small triumph, a reminder that the storm's fury could be resisted. New Yorkers, observing the suffering of animals, often extended acts of compassion. Neighbors shared hay, bundled horses in blankets, or guided stray dogs to temporary refuge. Even amid fear, hunger, and frost, kindness extended beyond humans, touching the city's creatures and offering a glimmer of warmth in an otherwise frozen world. By the fourth day of the blizzard, New York's hospitals were under immense strain. Patients arrived with frostbite, exhaustion, and illness exacerbated by the cold, each one a reminder of the storm's relentless toll. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, their hands red and raw from both the cold and the constant effort. moving between beds and rooms with a quiet urgency. Stoves and fireplaces were pushed to their limits, supplying the necessary warmth to prevent further suffering. Candles flickered alongside lanterns illuminating the tents, determined faces of those caring for the sick. Hallways were crowded with makeshift beds, blankets layered thickly to preserve heat, and the faint smell of burning coal mingled with that of medicinals and ointments. Every delivery of supplies, coal, bandages, food, water was a small victory. Yet uncertainty loomed. Frozen streets slowed transportation of critical medicine, and some families had no choice but to wait, hoping help would reach them. The nurses moved swiftly, offering not only medical aid but reassurance, their quiet voices carrying comfort through rooms otherwise silent except for the labored breathing of patients. Outside, the storm continued unabated, pressing down on the city like an invisible hand. But inside these hospitals, life persisted. The blizzard could freeze streets, trap families, and cut off communication. Yet it could not extinguish the dedication and care that flowed quietly through these halls. The human heart, steadfast and resolute, remained a warmth no storm could fully conquer. By now, the city's main avenues had been transformed into rivers of snow, flowing neither forward nor back, but pooling into deep valleys between walls of white. Broadway, once bustling with carts and pedestrians, resembled a frozen canyon, the tracks of those who dared to move marking only temporary paths that vanished in minutes. Workers and residents navigated carefully, using ropes tied between buildings or walls as guides. Every step was measured, deliberate, as hidden obstacles, benches, carts, fallen poles lurched unexpectedly beneath the snow. Occasionally, the muffled groan of collapsing structures reminded them of the storm's immense weight, prompting hurried retreats to safer ground. The snow, relentless in its accumulation, created both danger and curiosity. Children peered from windows, imagining vast landscapes of white, while adults weighed each journey against necessity. Food, coal, and communication demanded movement. Yet every excursion carried risk. Every alleyway was a potential trap. Every drift a hidden snare waiting to ensnare the unwary. Despite the threat, the city's inhabitants pressed on, shovels scraped, pickaxes chipped, and boots sank deep into icy mounds. Each cleared path, each safe passage carved through the frozen maze was a small victory, a demonstration of resilience, courage, and the quiet determination that defined New York in the grip of the blizzard. As snow piled higher, the threat of roof collapses became a constant concern. Buildings groaned under the immense weight, timbers creaking ominously as if warning of imminent failure. In wealthier homes, hired hands climbed onto rooftops, shovels in hand, clearing snow carefully, mindful of every step on icy shingles. In tenements, however, families were often left to manage on their own. Mothers and children pushed aside as much snow as they could reach, while fathers risked slipping on frozen surfaces. The wind gusted fiercely, throwing clouds of powder over rooftops, obscuring vision and adding fresh weight with each passing moment. Every creak, every snap of timber was a reminder that danger lay not only outside, but above street level. Observers watched nervously as snow shifted on neighboring roofs. One misplaced step or sudden collapse could send cascading avalanches into streets below, crushing wagons, fences, or even the unlucky passerby. Families held their breath, listening for the ominous groan of boards and beams, while children peeked from windows, eyes wide with fear and fascination. Yet even in this looming threat, action prevailed. Shovels scratched, snow was hauled down, and neighbors offered hands and guidance. The city moved cautiously, step by step, clearing paths and rooftops alike, learning to coexist with the immense heavy snow while preserving life as best they could. Crossing the East and Hudson rivers had become an ordeal of frozen peril bridges. Once bustling with horse-drawn carriages, pedestrians and early streetcars were now encased in ice, their surfaces slick and treacherous. Anyone attempting the crossing had to move with extreme care. boots scraping cautiously, hands gripping railings coated in frost. The ice creaked, underweight, groaning ominously, warning travelers of the thinness beneath their feet. Gusts of wind funneled across open spans, cutting through layers of wool and scarves, leaving cheeks raw and eyes watering. Horses were particularly vulnerable. Drivers coaxed and coaxed them across, holding the reins tight. Each step, a delicate negotiation with gravity and nature. Ferries had been halted entirely, their hulls trapped by ice along the docks. Only the bravest or most desperate attempted passage in small boats, pushing against the wind and choppy, frozen waves. The river itself seemed alive, shifting with the storm's rhythm, as if aware of the city's struggle above it. Despite the danger, these crossings were vital. Families needed supplies. Workers needed to reach essential posts, and messages still had to travel. Every successful passage was celebrated quietly, with a sigh of relief and whispered, "Thanks." Bridges, frozen and perilous though they were, became lifelines linking a city otherwise fragmented by the snow. As night returned once more, homes across New York were bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the snow-laden streets, but inside families gathered around the intimate, steady warmth of wax flames. Each flicker cast shadows on walls, painting the room with gentle, dancing patterns that softened the harshness of the storm. Outside, meals were shared quietly, the clink of spoons and bowls barely audible over the muffled roar of wind. Mothers reminded children to wrap themselves tightly in blankets. Fathers tended the fire with careful hands, and every ember was nurtured a small defense against the invading cold. Even the simple act of reading aloud a story, a letter or a hymn became a comforting ritual, threading warmth and normal through an otherwise extraordinary night. Candlelight also offered connection. Neighbors who had managed to tunnel paths through the snow sometimes shared their light with those nearby, placing lanterns at doorways or windows to guide travelers safely home. These glimmers, scattered through the city like tiny stars, reminded everyone that even in isolation, human presence endured. Outside, the storm raged relentless and indifferent. Yet inside these candle-lit rooms, families found calm. The night stretched long and silent, but the soft glow of flames, combined with whispered conversations and the warmth of shared bodies, created a small sanctuary, a place where hope could persist. Even as the blizzard pressed down from all sides, amid the relentless snow and ice, the city's gas lines began to falter. Frost clung to pipes, valves froze, and in some neighborhoods the flow of gas slowed to a mere trickle or stopped entirely. Homes that relied on gas for cooking and lighting faced dim, uncertain nights, while those already stretched thin by coal shortages struggled even more. Families, improvised candles and lanterns became essential. Their flames tended constantly to provide light and a sense of security. Stoves that depended on gas were substituted with wood or coal, each log carefully rationed to conserve warmth. Even cooking became a delicate task, requiring patience and vigilance to keep flames alive and meals edible. Repair crews worked tirelessly in the bitter cold, trudging through deep drifts to reach broken lines. Their hands, encased in thick gloves, struggled with frozen tools, each wrench and valve coated in ice. Despite the exhaustion and danger, these men labored relentlessly, understanding that their work was vital, not just for comfort but for life itself. In homes, residents adapted, leaning on ingenuity, and community neighbors shared fuel, swapped lanterns or offered spare candles, finding ways to light darkened rooms and prepare meals. Despite the adversity, in the face of frozen infrastructure, human resilience shone brightly, a quiet flame amid the white fury of the blizzard. With the storm continuing unabated, shops throughout the city were all but paralyzed. Doors remained locked, windows coated in frost, and the entrances blocked by drifts that rose higher than most passers-by could clear. Merchants peered through icy glass, assessing what goods remained and wondering when, if ever, they would be able to reopen. Inside, supplies dwindled rapidly. Breads and pastries hardened near stoves. Vegetables were carefully rationed, and coal, the lifeblood of warmth and cooking, was measured with exacting care. Shopkeepers improvised, moving goods closer to the hearth or melting small ice blocks to provide water for customers lucky enough to reach them. Every transaction, no matter how small, was a testament to persistence and human ingenuity. Outside drifts shifted constantly, obliterating paths almost as soon as they were cleared. Customers, if they could be called that, were few, braving the storm only when essential milk deliveries. Bread carts and coal wagons became lifelines, their arrival a cause for quiet relief in otherwise empty streets. The shops themselves became microcosms of survival. Candles flickered in frosted windows. Small groups gathered for warmth, and the simple act of bartering, purchasing, or even sharing goods became a quiet rebellion against the storm. Though the city was immobilized, its people found ways to continue living, proving that life persisted even in snowbound stillness. Mail carriers faced one of the most grueling tasks during the blizzard. Where streets had once been paved and bustling, now there were only towering drifts and treacherous ice. Carriers clutched bundles of letters and parcels tightly against their chests, their boots sinking knee-deep in snow, and every step felt like a battle against nature itself. Some attempted to use carts, but horses struggled through the drifts, hooves slipping on hidden ice, while wagons tipped or became trapped entirely. Those on foot relied solely on determination and guidance from hand-carved paths, calling out directions or following makeshift trails left by others. Every delivery was uncertain. Envelopes slipped from gloved hands, scattering across the white streets, and some packages were damaged or lost entirely beneath the unrelenting snow. Yet the carriers persisted. Each letter that reached its destination brought hope, news or comfort. Families treasured the small slips of communication, whispering thanks, reading hurriedly, and holding on to the fragile connection to the world beyond their snowbound homes. Even amidst exhaustion, frostbitten fingers, and near impossible conditions, these carriers became lifelines, threading human connection through a city otherwise immobilized. The blizzard was vast, indifferent and relentless, but the resolve of the postal workers shone through, proving that even in isolation, messages, care, and human connection could endure. By now the wind had become a constant presence, a living entity that swept through the city with eerie precision. It howled through the streets, rattled shutters, and bent lampposts, carrying snow and twisting blinding sheets that seemed determined to erase every trace of human life. Inside homes, the wind's roar penetrated walls, slipping through cracks and gaps, chilling rooms that were otherwise warmed by fires. Families huddled closer, listening to the eerie music of the storm, sometimes mournful, sometimes almost playful, but always powerful. Children imagined giants tossing snow across the city, while adults felt the weight of the storm, sheer indifference. Even outside, the wind dictated movement. Each step forward was a battle against its force. Each call to a neighbor swallowed quickly, only faintly returning as an echo. Shovels were lifted and dropped in rhythm with the gusts, and lantern flames flickered violently, threatening to extinguish under the white assault. Yet there was also beauty in the sound. If one could pause long enough to listen without fear, it was the voice of winter, of the city, transformed of a natural power beyond control. In that presence, New Yorkers learned patience, endurance, and the quiet acceptance that some forces could not be challenged, only endured. As snow piled higher, some residents began carving makeshift tunnels through the drifts. These narrow passageways connected homes to neighbors, shops, and essential supply points, creating hidden corridors in an otherwise impassable city. Each tunnel was a delicate work, carved carefully with shovels, picks, and even spoons. In smaller spaces, the tunnels were narrow, forcing travelers to stoop or crawl. and the walls of snow threatened collapse at every turn. Yet they offered warmth from the wind and a safer route for those needing to move between buildings. Children giggled quietly as they navigated the tight passages, their muffled laughter echoing softly, a rare sound of levity amid the white silence. Neighbors worked together to reinforce these tunnels, placing boards or tightly packed snow along walls to prevent collapse. In some areas, paths were lined with lanterns, their flickering light guiding travelers and illuminating the smooth, icy walls. Every successful passage became a small triumph, a testament to human ingenuity and collaboration. Through these tunnels, supplies moved more efficiently, families visited one another safely, and the city found hidden ways to endure. Even as the storm raged above and outside, below the snow, life continued quietly, persistent in narrow corridors carved by human hands. Some neighborhoods adapted more quickly than others, turning adversity into routine. Residents in tightly packed blocks developed a rhythm, shoveling in shifts, rationing food carefully and maintaining tunnels and paths that connected door to door. Children were given small tasks like carrying coal from one home to another or delivering messages along safe tunnels, teaching them responsibility while keeping them occupied and close to warmth. In wealthier districts, hired hands worked tirelessly, clearing roofs and paths, ensuring that stoves remained fed and lanterns stayed lit. In tenements, communities relied on shared efforts, pooling what little coal, wood and food they had. Doors were left unlocked to allow neighbors to take shelter if needed, and makeshift signals, lanterns and windows or lights on rooftops communicated safety and guidance through the blinding snow. Even in the most battered parts of the city, small victories were celebrated quietly. A cleared staircase, a shared meal, a successfully reinforced roof. Each act became a marker of resilience. The storm, while relentless, could not completely isolate the human spirit. It forced people to notice each other, rely on each other, and preserve hope through collective action. Through these resilient neighborhoods, New York endured the blizzard, pressed with white fury, yet in its shadow, humanity continued to forge connection, warmth, and survival. The riverfronts along the East and Hudson rivers were now scenes of stark, icy desolation. Ferries lay immobilized, hulls coated with frost decks buried beneath layers of snow. Ice pushed outward from the shore, forming jagged, slippery shelves that glistened in the pale daylight. The sound of flowing water was replaced by the occasional creak and crack of ice shifting, a reminder of nature's relentless presence. Dock workers who had survived the first days now faced a new challenge, keeping supplies moving despite frozen piers and impassable ferries. Some carried goods across ice-covered paths, balancing barrels of coal or bundles of firewood with painstaking care. Each step was precarious. One slip could mean injury or worse, falling into freezing water beneath a thin layer of ice. Passengers were stranded, waiting on docks that offered little shelter. Families huddled together, wind cutting sharply across exposed faces, watching ferrymen and laborers navigate the perilous ice. The riverfront, normally alive with commerce and motion, had become a silent frozen expanse, both dangerous and mesmerizing in its stark beauty. Even in this frozen liminality, human determination persisted. Men and women adapted, finding routes through the ice, building temporary ramps and relying on lanterns and signals to guide movement. Life along the rivers was suspended, yet not extinguished. The city's resilience extended to its edges where ice met human ingenuity. For the city's poorest residents, the blizzard posed a particular danger. Tenements, already cramped and drafty, were ill-equipped to withstand the relentless cold. Roofs sagged under the snow. Chimneys struggled to carry smoke, and thin walls allowed frost to creep in. Families layered whatever they could find, blankets, newspapers, coats, to preserve warmth. Yet nights remained, bitter and long. Food scarcity hit hardest here. Grocery supplies ran low, quickly, and the poor often relied on shared scraps or improvised meals. Children went without, small faces pale and lips blue, while parents struggled to ration meager portions to keep everyone alive. Every firewood log and every coal lump was precious, and neighbors often shared what little they had, understanding that survival depended on cooperation. Some local charities and churches opened doors offering warmth, meals, and shelter. Yet the sheer scale of the storm meant that not everyone could be accommodated. Volunteers worked tirelessly, shoveling paths, delivering supplies, and guiding residents to temporary refuge, their efforts a lifeline against the overwhelming white tide. Even amid deprivation and danger, these communities displayed quiet courage. Families huddled together, neighbors leaned on one another, and the city's most vulnerable found ways to endure. The blizzard, fierce and indiscriminate, revealed both the fragility and the resilience of human life in its harshest moments. The city's markets, usually bustling centers of trade and chatter, had become ghostly landscapes. Stalls were buried under snow, their wares hidden beneath white blankets that sparkled faintly in the dim light. Vegetables wilted in cold storage, fruits froze solid, and fish lay encased in ice, glinting eerily under lanterns or gas lamps. Vendors who braved the storm worked with relentless determination. Some cleared paths through drifts to display their goods, while others used makeshift roofs of tarpaulin or boards to protect what remained from the snow. The air was filled with the scent of frozen produce, coal, smoke, and damp wool from the laboring bodies of those keeping the market alive. Customers were few, moving cautiously through the treacherous streets. Each purchase was deliberate, often rationed and accompanied by quiet gratitude. Small exchanges, money for bread, coal, or vegetables, felt weighty, precious, as if each transaction was a tiny act of survival itself. In this frozen marketplace, human resilience shone. Despite the storm's overwhelming power, the markets remained a hub of necessity, connection, and endurance. Through frost and snow, life continued quiet, measured, and steadfast, sustaining both body and spirit. In the heart of a city under siege by winter, even the humble mailbox became a symbol of struggle and hope. During the blizzard, snow and ice coated every surface, sometimes sealing the small doors shut entirely. Letters that did make it through the storm were often soggy, frozen, or bent. Yet they carried immense significance, news from afar, messages of concern, and reminders that loved ones were thinking of one another. Mail carriers braved treacherous paths to deliver them. Some walked miles through knee-deep snow, balancing bundles of letters against their chests, eyes squinting against the swirling white. Others used sleds to slide small parcels over drifts, carefully adjusting each delivery so nothing was lost in the wind. For families, even a single letter brought comfort. Children pressed close to parents as they read words from distant relatives. Parents smiled with quiet relief at messages of safety. In these moments, the frozen mailbox became more than metal. It became a lifeline, a conduit of human connection that the storm could not sever. Despite exhaustion, and the ever-present cold, mail carriers and recipients alike demonstrated the dot city's resilience. The blizzard might have halted commerce, travel, and conversation, but it could not extinguish communication, the desire to connect, or the hope carried in every letter delivered against impossible odds. Nightfall during the blizzard was particularly haunting. Darkness enveloped the city, and the falling snow seemed to absorb every sound, leaving only the whisper of wind and the occasional groan of ice-laden structures. Streets disappeared under deep drifts, lamplight dimmed beneath white blankets, and familiar landmarks vanished from view. Families huddled together in small rooms, fires burning low to conserve fuel, lanterns flickering on windowsills. The hush of snow created a surreal, almost magical atmosphere, but it was tinged with anxiety. Every creak of a roof, Every howl of wind reminded inhabitants of the storm's relentless presence. Children slept fitfully, dreaming of open skies and warm streets, while adults whispered reassurances, balancing fear with careful vigilance. In wealthier homes, stoves glowed steadily, while in tenements, neighbors shared warmth blankets and stories to ward off both cold and despair. Outside, those still moving through the streets relied on lanterns and ropes, tracing cautious paths through the whitened cityscape. Night during the blizzard was both beautiful and terrifying. A quiet, frozen world suspended between survival and hope in the darkness. The city seemed fragile, yet its people held tight, enduring until the promise of morning light might bring relief, even if just for a moment. Firefighters faced a unique and dangerous challenge during the blizzard. Snow-blocked streets, slowed horses, and buried fire hydrants under drifts, making even a short response to emergencies a monumental task. Yet fires still broke out. Stoves overheated, chimneys cracked, and accidents in kitchens or lamps sparked small blazes that threatened entire buildings. Brave crews, wrapped in layers of wool and leather, trudged through knee-deep snow, pulling heavy hoses, navigating treacherous streets, and carrying equipment that froze in their hands. Each step was calculated, each movement weighed against slipping, falling, or losing a crucial tool in the snow. The air was sharp, breaths visible in the icy gusts, while lanterns and torches illuminated the whitened streets just enough to mark a path. Neighbors assisted whenever possible, clearing snow or guiding firefighters through familiar alleys and tunnels inside burning buildings. Families watched anxiously, knowing help was near, but understanding that time was measured in heartbeats and frozen minutes. Despite exhaustion and danger, the firefighters pressed on. Each life saved, each fire contained, was a small triumph against the storm's overwhelming force. In these acts, the city witnessed courage and resilience, a reminder that even when nature seemed insurmountable, human determination could still make a difference. Streetcars, once lifelines weaving through the city, were now trapped beneath layers of snow and ice. Tracks disappeared under towering drifts. Wheels jammed against frozen rails, and the trolleys themselves groaned under the strain of ice accumulation. For many, the sudden halt of these familiar vehicles meant isolation, as daily commutes, deliveries, and errands ground to a standstill. Conductors and operators worked tirelessly, scraping ice from tracks, greasing wheels, and attempting to clear paths just enough to move. Horses, often used to assist when power failed, struggled through deep drifts, slipping and sliding their riders, urging them forward with patient persistence. Every attempt to restore motion was met with partial success, followed by yet another layer of snow that the blizzard relentlessly added. Passengers adapted, turning to walking or relying on neighbors to share supplies. Conversations about when the streetcar will run again became a daily refrain, often mixed with cautionary advice about safety in the snowbound streets. Children pressed faces to frosted windows, imagining the vehicles sliding through white streets, dreaming of a city restored to motion. Though halted, the streetcars represented both frustration and hope. Their frozen stillness symbolized the blizzard's dominance, yet every effort to move them, to clear tracks, or even to repair the machinery was a quiet act of defiance, a testament to the city's resilience and determination to reclaim its lifelines. Neon avenues and in parks, trees were transformed into frozen sculptures. Branches drooped under the weight of snow and ice, bending so low that pedestrians had to duck or carefully push past. Icicles hung like glass chandeliers, glittering faintly when lanterns or weak sunlight caught them, creating a surreal, otherworldly landscape. In some areas the weight proved too much. Limbs snapped with muffled cracks, sending showers of snow and ice crashing to the streets below. Careful observers avoided walking directly under these natural chandeliers, knowing a sudden collapse could be dangerous. Still, many paused to marvel at the beauty caught between awe and caution. Children peering from windows imagined winter kingdoms where forests glimmered with frozen magic. Adults, while mindful of danger, could not help but feel the quiet wonder of a city transformed even amid hardship. The ice-covered trees offered moments of reflection, a reminder that nature could create beauty even in its harshest expressions. Communities worked together to clear paths beneath the largest trees, ensuring safe passage for neighbors and supplies. These simple acts, paired with the serene, glittering streets, highlighted a balance of peril and beauty, struggle and admiration, a city learning to navigate and endure in frozen splendor. As the blizzard entered its 5th day, frostbite became an ever-present danger. Exposed skin froze quickly, and even brief ventures outside could leave fingers, toes, and cheeks painfully numb or permanently damaged. Residents wrapped themselves in multiple layers scarves, mittens and fur whenever possible, yet the biting wind found every gap it could. Parents watched children closely, their small hands pressed to cheeks or tucked inside heavy mittens. Workers, mail carriers, and delivery men checked each other constantly for signs of frostbite, sharing warmth when possible and urging caution. Even brief exposure could be perilous. An awareness of the invisible threat hung over every journey, adding tension to the already grueling task of moving through deep drifts. Lanterns and fires offered warmth, but only in small circles. Between these pockets of heat, the cold remained ruthless, penetrating boots, coats, and gloves, reminding everyone of the storm's merciless reach. Hospitals treated an increasing number of cases, yet for many, prevention was the only viable safeguard. Despite the danger, New Yorkers adapted. Quick movement, careful layering, and teamwork became essential. Those who ventured out understood the delicate balance of necessity and risk, learning firsthand that survival required both courage and prudence in equal measure. With the storm showing no sign of abating, some neighborhoods organized night watches. Groups of residents took turns patrolling streets, checking on neighbors, reinforcing snow-cleared paths, and keeping lanterns lit to guide travelers. These watches were both practical and comforting, ensuring that no one was truly alone amid the silent white expanse. Men and women moved cautiously, listening for cries for help or the groan of roofs under heavy snow. Lanterns cast flickering circles of light on drifts that stretched endlessly, illuminating familiar buildings in a new, almost alien way. Even brief exchanges between watch members, a whispered question, a nod, a shared glance, strengthened the bonds that kept the community intact. Children were kept close, often peeking from windows to see the watchers pass their imaginations, turning the patrols into heroic journeys across a frozen kingdom. Adults, while weary, found solace in shared responsibility, knowing that vigilance could prevent tragedy and maintain morale. Through these night watches, neighborhoods became small islands of safety and connection. The blizzard might have enveloped the city in cold and snow, yet human presence, diligence, and care created warmth, light, and reassurance even in the darkest hours. Water, once a simple necessity, became a daily challenge. Wells froze, their surfaces capped with thick ice, forcing residents to chip through or melt snow. To obtain drinking water in tenements, buckets were filled carefully and rationing became essential. One misstep, a dropped pail or a cracked ice surface, could mean lost water and added hardship. Families took turns fetching water, often venturing into streets where snow reached knee-height, carrying heavy containers back to the relative warmth of home. The sound of splintering ice, the splash of water, and the hiss of heated kettles became daily rituals, a constant rhythm of survival. Children learned to help carefully, holding handles steady, observing the necessary patience and caution. Neighbors often cooperated, sharing water when one well was inaccessible or when snow made a home's own supply unattainable. Even in scarcity, community efforts ensured that everyone received at least enough to sustain life. Through this struggle, the simple act of drinking water became profound. It reminded residents of the fragility of comfort, the necessity of adaptation, and the quiet endurance that allowed them to survive day by day in a city buried beneath relentless snow and ice. For brief, fleeting moments the blizzard would ease, just enough to create an eerie silence. The wind paused. Snow fell lightly or stopped entirely, and the city seemed suspended, frozen in time. Streets were white rivers, rooftops glittered under the pale light, and even the muffled creaks of buildings were quieter. Almost respectful of the momentary calm, residents often paused to notice this silence. Families huddled by stoves listening to the faint stillness outside. The occasional distant groan of ice or collapsing roof, the only reminders of the storm's presence. Children pressed faces to windows, marveling at the softened landscape, imagining worlds made entirely of snow. Adults allowed themselves a brief breath, a rare chance to rest without the immediate pressure of survival pressing on every action. Yet even in silence, caution remained. Snow could shift suddenly, drifts could collapse, and the blizzard could return at any moment. The respite was a reminder of both beauty and fragility, a brief window to reflect, to connect, and to prepare for what would come next. In these quiet intervals, the city held its collective breath, sensing the storm's omnipresence even in its temporary absence, and gathering strength to endure the next wave of white fury. By the fifth night, coal, a lifeline for warmth, had become scarce. Many families already rationing fuel now faced the reality that their stoves might not last. Through the night, piles of coal outside homes froze solid, and deliveries were delayed or impossible due to snow-blocked streets. Residents measured each piece carefully, feeding fires sparingly to preserve heat while still warding off the creeping cold. Children were often tasked with bringing small pieces to stoves or helping stack logs, learning the value of patience and careful management. In some tenements, neighbors pulled coal, ensuring that every stove could burn even minimally through the bitter night. Street deliveries continued, though slowly and perilously. Coal wagons moved inch by inch through deep drifts, horses struggling with every step, drivers shouting through wind and snow. When a delivery finally arrived, gratitude was quiet but profound. Every chunk represented life, comfort, and survival in a city frozen and isolated. Even as scarcity tightened its grip, New Yorkers adapted. Ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience transformed fuel into a symbol of endurance, a reminder that warmth, both physical and emotional, could be sustained even in the harshest of winters. As dusk fell, the city's frozen shops took on a ghostly glow. Gas lamps flickered weakly through frosted windows, casting long shadows across snow-covered streets. Inside, only a few stubborn vendors remained tending to the last of their goods. Loaves of bread, bundles of coal, or scraps of vegetables, carefully rationed to serve those who braved the storm. The cold made every movement deliberate. Hands, gloved or bare, moved slowly, tending stoves, stacking wares, and ensuring that supplies did not freeze completely. The air was filled with the mingling scents of coal, smoke, damp wool, and preserved food, a subtle reminder of life continuing despite the relentless white outside. Customers ventured cautiously, gliding over icy patches, following paths carved by previous travelers. Each purchase felt like a small victory, a necessary moment of survival and an act of defiance against the immobilizing snow. Conversations were brief, but warm words exchanged through scarves and layers of clothing, carrying gratitude and human connection. In these frozen shops, New Yorkers found more than goods. They found hope, community, and the quiet resilience that sustained them. Even as night deepened, and the storm continued its unyielding presence, churches became sanctuaries during the blizzard, both physically and spiritually. With streets blocked and homes cold, many residents turned to these buildings for warmth, prayer, and community. Candles flickered in stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across pews and walls, while fires and stoves or hearths provided much-needed heat. Inside, Congregants gathered quietly, sharing blankets, food, and reassurance. Priests and ministers moved among them, offering comfort and guidance, their voices gentle against the muffled roar of the storm. Outside, hymns were sung softly, each note resonating through the quiet sanctuary, a reminder that faith and human connection endured even in the harshest conditions. Children listened from laps or corners, eyes wide at the flickering flames and the soft murmur of prayers. Adults found solace in shared presence, understanding that strength could be drawn from both community and belief. Even in the most desperate moments, the churches provided a temporary refuge from the storm's unyielding grip. The snowbound sanctuaries became beacons, both literal and figurative, illuminating the resilience, compassion, and unity of a city facing one of its coldest and harshest nights in history. Carriages, once the arteries of the city, were now immobilized by snowdrifts and ice. Horses struggled against the towering walls of white, their breath visible in thick clouds as drivers urged them forward. Wooden wheels scraped harshly against icy patches, and some carriages tipped or became stuck entirely, requiring multiple men to push them free. Despite the peril, carriages remained essential. They delivered food, coal, medicine, and occasionally, passengers who had no alternative. Each journey was slow, deliberate, and fraught with danger. Yet perseverance was the only option. Drivers wrapped in layers of wool and fur navigated carefully, lanterns swinging to light their path, eyes squinting against the swirling snow. Passengers huddled under blankets, holding tight to reins or the sides of the carriage, their faces pale but determined. Inside, warmth was fleeting, stolen from the horses' exertion and the meager protection of layers of cloth. Yet every successful trip, no matter how treacherous, brought relief and sustenance to families waiting behind frosted windows. The frozen carriages were more than transportation. They were symbols of persistence, courage, and the slow, steady heartbeat of a city refusing to surrender to the storm. As evening settled over New York, tenements hummed with quiet activity. Families gathered around small stoves, sharing whatever warmth they could generate. The aroma of thin soups and baked bread mingled with the sharp scent of coal smoke, filling cramped apartments with reminders of sustenance and survival. Children huddled close to parents or siblings, blankets pulled tight, listening to stories whispered over the soft crackle of fire. Every sound, the distant howl of wind, the muffled groan of snow-laden roofs, the creak of wooden floors was softened within the walls, creating a cocoon of relative calm. Amidst the storm, neighbors checked in on one another, offering a spare log, a bundle of coal, or words of reassurance. Even in the most modest dwellings, acts of care and community provided warmth beyond what fire alone could give. Laughter, though quiet, occasionally pierced the winter. Stillness, a reminder of resilience, hope, and human connection. The tenements, though battered and cold, became sanctuaries. They were spaces where the city's endurance could be felt in tangible ways, in shared warmth, quiet, vigilance, and the comforting knowledge that, even in the harshest winter, no one faced the blizzard entirely alone. At last, after days of relentless snow and wind, a faint light signaled the coming of dawn. The blizzard had eased, leaving a city transformed. Streets were buried beneath mountains of white roofs, glistened with ice, and every tree and fence was outlined in frost. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of snow, coal smoke, and the faint warmth of human habitation. Residents emerged cautiously from their homes, eyes wide at the changed landscape. Children ran into the streets testing drifts, laughing as their boots sank into soft snow. Adults surveyed the damage, noting collapsed roofs, broken branches, and buried pathways. Yet relief mingled with the exhaustion. The storm had passed, and the city, though battered, had endured. Neighbors helped one another, clearing paths, rescuing trapped animals, and checking on those who had struggled the most. Shops reopened slowly, Fires burned brighter and the rhythm of life resumed, tentative but determined. Every small act, handing a loaf of bread, carrying a pail of water, sharing warmth, was a testament to resilience and hope. New York City had survived the Great Blizzard of 188. Though it left scars, it also revealed the enduring strength, courage, and unity of its people. A city forever marked by winter, yet defined by the human spirit that could withstand even the harshest cold. After the storm had finally spent its fury, a profound quiet settled over New York City. The relentless wind had calmed, leaving only the soft whisper of snow shifting in the morning light. Streets, sidewalks, and alleyways were buried beneath deep drifts, transforming familiar neighborhoods into an entirely new world. A city paused. Frozen in white serenity, residents emerged slowly, moving carefully over the packed snow. Every step created a small crunch beneath boots, echoing in the stillness. People helped one another, clearing entrances, digging out pathways, and rescuing horses, wagons, and carriages trapped beneath the weight of ice and snow. Children marveled at the sparkling landscape, their laughter soft yet bright against the muted city. Homes and tenements bore the visible scars of survival: sagging roofs, broken chimneys, and frost-laden windows. Yet within these buildings, families shared quiet relief, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm drinks and offering whispered thanks for having endured together. The city's rhythm was slow, measured, as life cautiously resumed at this moment. The Great Blizzard of 1888 revealed more than destruction. It revealed resilience, compassion, and unity. The streets may have been frozen and the nights long and bitter, but the hearts of New Yorkers beat steadily beneath layers of wool, coal, smoke, and frost, strong, enduring, and ready to reclaim the life and warmth of their beloved city. In the days following the blizzard, the city slowly began to reconnect. Families ventured further, checking on neighbors who had been isolated, sharing supplies and exchanging stories of survival. Paths through snowdrifts were widened and reinforced, turning the temporary tunnels and narrow trails of the storm into more permanent lifelines. Children, now more familiar with snow's challenges, helped carry coal-shoveled sidewalks and guided smaller animals back to safety. Their energy and curiosity brought a quiet joy to streets that had been heavy with white silence. Adults coordinated repairs, cleared debris, and ensured that essential services, coal deliveries, food distribution, and mail resumed as efficiently as possible. Amid these efforts, moments of connection became deeply significant. Simple gestures, a shared loaf of bread, a helping hand, a warm meal, reinforced the bonds that had carried communities through the storm. Even those in wealthier neighborhoods reached out to assist those less fortunate, recognizing that survival had been collective, not individual. Through these actions, the city not only recovered physically but emotionally. The blizzard had isolated, challenged, and tested New Yorkers. Yet in its aftermath, human connection proved stronger than snow or ice. The resilience forged in frozen adversity became the foundation for a city that would continue, day by day, to thrive again. With the storm finally subsiding, the animals of New York began to emerge from their hiding places. Horses, weary but alive, stepped carefully through cleared streets, their breath steaming in the crisp air. Dogs and cats, once lost or trapped, returned to familiar homes, guided by the faint smell of their families or the careful voices calling them from windows. People checked on their livestock, ensuring water and food were available and assessing any injuries from frost or exhaustion. Stray animals were guided to temporary shelters, and neighbors shared resources to ensure that no creature was left behind. Even birds returned, gradually perching on icy branches, their chirps faint but persistent reminders of life resuming. The presence of animals brought comfort to the city. Children laughed at playful dogs, adults smiled at returning horses, and the simple rhythm of feeding, caring, and observing the creatures reminded everyone that life could endure even after harshest trials. The city, blanketed in snow and ice, seemed quieter yet fuller, filled with the hum of recovery, soft sounds of life and the promise that spring, though distant, could eventually return. As the sun rose higher in the sky, crews of workers, volunteers and neighbors began the painstaking task of clearing the streets. Shovels, pickaxes and horse-drawn carts moved rhythmically through snowbanks, turning the frozen cityscape back into pathways of human movement. The streets, once rivers of snow and ice, slowly transformed. Paths appeared between buildings. Intersections reopened, and main avenues, though still heavy with snow, allowed cautious travel. Children ran alongside cleared paths, testing their balance on icy edges, while adults guided horses and wagons carefully through the thawing chaos. Every cleared street was a small victory. Shopkeepers reopened doors. Coal deliveries resumed more efficiently, and neighbors were able to visit one another without navigating treacherous tunnels or risking frostbite. The city's pulse quickened, measured yet steady, as life slowly reclaimed the frozen expanse. Even as drifts remained and rooftops still sagged under ice, the clearing of streets symbolized hope, endurance, and the relentless human effort to restore normal after nature's overwhelming display. After days of confinement, residents began venturing further into the city. Streets were still lined with high drifts. Roofs sagged under remaining snow, and icicles hung like chandeliers from every eave. Yet the desire to reconnect, to assess damage, and to resume life was stronger than the lingering chill. People moved cautiously, boots crunching in packed snow, scarves wrapped tightly, and eyes scanning for weak spots in icy sidewalks or collapsed roofs. Children followed adults, small hands grasping for warmth, their laughter a soft but bright contrast to the whitened streets. Vendors reopened shops, partially offering essential goods to those navigating the newly carved paths. Neighbors greeted each other with smiles and quiet words of relief. Stories of survival were exchanged, some tinged with humor, others with awe at narrow escapes. The city felt alive again, not fully restored but breathing, moving and cautiously optimistic. Even amidst lingering cold and towering snow, the act of stepping outside became symbolic, an assertion that life, connection, and hope would continue despite the blizzard's ferocity. As residents explored the streets after the blizzard, they discovered the accidental artistry left behind by the storm. Snow and ice had sculpted trees, fences, and rooftops into fantastical shapes, while drifts formed natural tunnels, arches, and glimmering mounds. Some structures resembled towers, others delicate lace and sunlight caught on icicles, making the city sparkle as though dusted with diamonds. Children eagerly wandered, touching frozen formations, imagining kingdoms and castles, and carefully navigating the icy playgrounds. Adults, too, paused, appreciating the surreal beauty created by nature's harsh hand, a reminder that even in destruction there could be wonder. Neighbors took small moments to admire these works, sometimes adding their own playful touches, building small snow forts or carving paths between drifts. The snow, once a relentless adversary, became a source of fascination, a bridge between survival and enjoyment. Amid the wreckage and fatigue, the city found magic. The blizzard's aftermath was not only a challenge to endure, but also a landscape to explore, reflect upon, and marvel at, proof that beauty could exist even in the harshest winters. In the days following the storm, shared meals became a comforting ritual across neighborhoods. Families and neighbors pulled what little food remained, creating small gatherings in homes, tenements, and churches. Pots of soup simmered over stoves. Bread was broken collectively, and the warmth of companionship offset the lingering chill in the air. Children helped by fetching water, stirring pots, or setting simple tables, learning the value of cooperation and care. Adults conversed quietly, recounting stories of survival, clever improvisations, and small victories from the storm. Even those who had little to share found a place, a warm corner, or a helping hand, emphasizing community over scarcity. The act of eating together restored more than physical energy. It rebuilt bonds frayed by isolation and adversity. Laughter, quiet conversation, and the simple clink of utensils created a rhythm of life, reinforcing that, even after nature's harshest trials, human connection remained unbroken. Through these shared meals, hope and resilience were nourished alongside the body, feeding the spirit of a city that had weathered one of the fiercest winters in history. Once the streets were passable, attention turned upward. Snow-laden rooftops posed dangers, with the weight of ice and drifts threatening collapse. Residents and hired hands climbed carefully, breaking and shoveling snow and reinforcing structures wherever possible. The work was slow and deliberate. Every movement had to be precise to avoid slipping on frozen shingles or accidentally sending a cascade of snow onto those below. Ladders were propped against sturdy walls, ropes tied for safety and tools handled with meticulous care. Families watched from below, offering assistance by carrying buckets, wood, or lanterns to illuminate the work. Clearing rooftops was more than maintenance. It was a ritual of survival and reclaiming control over the environment. Each cleared roof signaled safety, readiness for the next storm, and the perseverance of human ingenuity. In the quiet after the blizzard, the act of restoration became both practical and symbolic, a promise that life in the city would continue despite nature's force. Finally, the postal system began to function more reliably. Mail carriers, having braved days of deep snow and icy streets, resumed more consistent deliveries. Letters, once delayed for days or weeks, arrived at doors bringing news, reassurance, and connection. Children ran to retrieve letters from frozen mailboxes, faces flushed with excitement, while adults carefully unfolded fragile envelopes, reading with relief and sometimes laughter. In homes where isolation had been most acute, a single letter could brighten spirits and rekindle hope. The act of receiving mail became a celebration of resilience. Neighbors exchanged stories of what had arrived, shared messages, and marveled at the fact that communication had endured despite the storm's severity. Each delivery reinforced that the city was reawakening slowly, reconnecting and restoring its lifelines through the reopening of mail routes. The great blizzard's hold on daily life loosened, replaced by small triumphs, reconnections, and the quiet reassurance that the city was once again capable of moving forward. By the following week, New York City was stirring fully from its frozen pause. Snow still clung to rooftops. Streets retained traces of drifts, and ice hung like ornaments from every eave. But life had returned. Shopkeepers opened doors with cautious optimism. Children played in cleared yards, and the rhythm of daily routine slowly resumed. Neighbors checked in on one another, ensuring that everyone had recovered from the harshest days. Fires burned steadily in homes. Stoves once again provided warmth and meals, and the hum of the city footsteps, horse-drawn wagons, distant voices returned like a comforting heartbeat. Even the scars of the storm, the broken branches, collapsed roofs, and frost-bitten landscapes were reminders of endurance, courage, and the resilience of a city that had weathered one of the most brutal winters in history. The great blizzard of 1888 left New York changed, yet the people had proven their strength. Through hardship, isolation, and relentless cold, they endured together, forging bonds, discovering resourcefulness, and emerging into the light with a renewed sense of hope. The city, frozen and battered, had awakened not merely to survive, but to thrive once more. Thank you for journeying through the great blizzard of 1888 with me. As the city slowly reclaimed life after the storm, so too can we let the quiet resilience of these stories guide us into rest. Feel the calm of snow-covered streets, the warmth of shared meals, and the gentle glow of candlelit homes as you settle in for sleep. If you found comfort and wonder in this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Whether you're watching from the US, Europe, or anywhere else at this very moment, share your thoughts, your favorite moments, or simply the feeling this story brought you. Now take a deep breath. Let the lingering chill fade and allow the peace of history's quiet triumphs to lull you into a gentle, restorative sleep. The great blizzard has passed, and so can you, into rest.